I'm really excited this evening that we will have Dr. Hennacy Powell with us. She'll be joining us in just a moment. Her book, The ESP Enigma, is one of my absolute favorites. I've read it over and over, and it is just packed with case studies and scientific evidence for psychic phenomena, and that's what we'll be exploring this evening. I know that Dr. Powell was raised by very smart parents who encouraged her enthusiasm for academia and science, and she really has made exploration, scientific research, the top priority in life. She's extremely interesting. I encourage you to check out her website, DianeHennacyPowell.com. There's also a link on our Psychic Access guest profile. But I know that Dr. Powell is extremely interested in human consciousness, covering neuroscience, physics, psychology, spirituality, genetics, even molecular biology, anthropology, and pretty much everything. So we're going to have a fantastic interview. Diane, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here, Diane. You know, I'm a big fan, and I've read your book so many times. I think my first question for you, Diane, is when did you first become interested in psychic phenomena?
Well, I really was raised with, science, as you mentioned in your introduction. And when I was in medical school, I was trained as a psychiatrist afterwards, and but when I was even at the beginning, in my first clerkship in psychiatry, they were telling me as a medical student that if someone tells you that they're capable of reading other people's minds or that other people can read theirs, that it's a sign of insanity. So that's how I had been trained at Johns Hopkins, which was the #1 medical school and university in the country at the time, and still is. So when I was on faculty at Harvard, I was teaching neuropsychiatry, and I was very, very much in the model of neuroscience and neuropsychiatry, but I at the same time was someone who liked to listen to patients and learn from them, and I was asked to do a consult on this woman who had come in the night before, and she had complained of the symptoms of having a heart attack, and they admitted her. And the next day, she was wanting to leave the hospital against medical advice because you can't. She was seeing ghosts, and she was feeling just like this isn't going to work. And she also was telling people she was psychic, and so. You can't leave the hospital against medical advice if the staff think you're insane, and so that's why they called me in as a psychiatrist to declare her incompetent to sign out. And they were shocked when I came back and I didn't declare her incompetent to sign out, because when I went in to see her, she started to tell me all of these things in detail about myself that there was no way she could possibly know. And on top of that, she predicted things in the future, which eventually came true. Very specific things, like how many children I'd have and where I'd live and what I do for a living. I mean, yeah.
So that made you intrigued and wanting to research psychic phenomena.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was raised that if you have data that throws out your theory, I mean, that it really says, it flies in the face of, what you've been taught as, the theory, then you have to challenge your theory. You don't throw out the data. And unfortunately, in science today, there is a lot of data out there that is just totally ignored, and if it gets on their radar, it gets shot down before it's even looked at closely, because it is just so threatening to the paradigm that they're all doing their research and believing is the paradigm for understanding consciousness.
Do you feel, though, Diane, that tendency is starting to change, that the scientific community is a little more open than it used to be, or is it still as challenging as ever?
It's interesting. I would say that it's kind of like the what else is going on in this country. This country is very polarized, and so there are doctors and scientists who are very open to this science, and I've converted many people who are skeptics by just showing them the data. And so there is a shift changing, but then, just like what you see happening in other arenas, where there's change happening, there's also resistance to that change as well. So we have both things going on.
And why do you feel people resist when data is available?
Well, it's interesting. I'm a psychiatrist, and so I spend a lot of time with that. When why do people resist that which is not familiar, to them? And it really shakes people's world up, it's look at how much they resisted the idea that the Earth went around the sun, rather than the other way around.
It's true. But it seems that people resist looking at the data. I know I'm not a scientist, but as an astrologer, I love a conversation with a skeptic and say, well, how much research have you done on astrology? Mm-hmm. Because you can't refute it if you do the research. So is it that that the scientific community just doesn't want to pay much attention to these findings, this data?
Well, when it's not just that, it's also you put yourself on the firing line when you do what I do. In fact, I had consequences for writing a book with ESP in the title. People, the medical board read the title, and they were suspicious of my sanity. Didn't read the book. Just like the skeptics don't really go in and dive into the research and really want to see, is there really anything in here? They don't look at it. They just disclaim it, right off the cuff. And so what's happened is when you've had scientists who put themselves out there and say, no, I think there's something to this, there's a lot of backlash. Like John Mack was someone who, at Harvard, he was someone who was down the hall from me, and after I had left, he did research on people who had been sent to him by the government for evaluation, and they were people who had claimed that they had been abducted. And all he said really in his first book was that he didn't see evidence for them having a sign of mental illness. He didn't say that they were abducted. It's true. He didn't say anything like that. But just saying that he didn't see any evidence of mental illness was enough for him to actually have to fight with attorneys for his tenure at Harvard. Harvard tried to kick him off the faculty.
Wow. Well,
yeah, and he was the person who actually founded the department of psychiatry at the hospital that he was at. So he was a psychoanalyst, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning psychoanalyst that happened to. So scientists there are scientists who will tell you behind closed doors that they believe in this stuff, but there's no way they'd ever go public about it.
Well, we're glad that you did, Diane. Your book, and I'm not just saying this to flatter you, your book is, I've been reading books about extrasensory perception, the paranormal, metaphysics since I was about 7, and yours is my favorite. It's absolutely fascinating and full of evidence. And I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about the first chapter, which is focused upon the brain and consciousness. What can you share with us to help us understand consciousness better than we perhaps do?
Oh, there's a reason I wrote a book, and actually I could write volumes.
You should.
You could narrow the question down a little bit. I mean, one of the things that I did do in the beginning of the book is I look at the model that neuroscientists hold on to so dearly. It's this, that the brain is what creates consciousness, and that we are really just basically biological robots. That is a model that is held on to very dearly by neuroscientists. And yet, if you look at that model, it doesn't explain much at all. It doesn't explain free will. That's a huge question. How could there be free will? And yet people have this sense that they have free will. But the neuroscience model is really actually a very deterministic model if you actually look at it and closely. But people, that's kind of a scary place to go. So people don't quite go there. But the reality is, it doesn't explain free will. Then it also doesn't explain why we have this experience that there's an I there, that there's a me, that there's, this, but a lot of us would say is a soul, this observing, experiencing being, that has not just, mundane experiences, but then these really spiritual experiences and all kinds of other things. It doesn't really explain that at all. Why we have that sense that there's any me there. There's this argument within artificial intelligence as to whether or not if you created a computer and you really had all the algorithms for human consciousness, would it actually really truly develop a sense of I? and that's and a lot of people say that's absurd, and that's really though what neuroscience says. So in the first chapter, I talk about just these holes like that, and another one is understanding even some of the things that scientists say that they accept as real, like autistic savants, which is one of the reasons why I've spent the last several years looking into their abilities.
Well, you read my mind because I was literally about to say that I read your very interesting blog about autistic savants, and I've got a lot of things I want to ask you about, Diane, but could you help us to understand autism, or particularly those cases of autistic savants?
Well, let me first of all explain for people what autistic savant means, so that people are clear about that. So autism is this condition in which people have both a language and a social impairment, and so they frequently are mute. And or if they do have language, it can be aberrant in some way. And of course, there's the whole spectrum. You have people who have autism, and their language really is very intact, except for some quirks. For example, they may flip pronouns, and use you to refer to someone, to themselves, because they hear someone else calling them you, and so then instead of saying I, they'd say you. so it can be a quirk like that. But anyway, so they have something about their language that is not typical, and then also there's ability to socialize as well as compromised. And so that's what autism is, and then the savant comes in, and what that is that they have these abilities that are phenomenal. For example, the ability to Kim Peek knew over 12,000 books. By the time he died in his late 50s, he knew over 12,000 books, word for word, memorized, backwards and forwards. He could recite them. And, so phenomenal memory, the abilities to do calculations such as coming up with prime numbers or cube, what's the cube root of a several-digit number, and doing it, and yet here's why it's a savant skill. It's not just that they're like a genius, but they're doing this, and yet they don't actually have the basic primary building blocks that one has. These are people who, so they're giving you the cube root of a 6-digit number, but they don't even know how to add 3 plus 4. And so that's the part that makes it so like, how do they do that? It's because genius, there's lots of cases of genius, and people just say, well, we don't understand genius. But these are people who've had, the connectivity of their brain is not that of other people. They're Kim Peek was somebody who had major hydrocephalus when he was a child, and so he lost actual brain matter, and yet here he's memorized 12,000 books. How does that fit in with the current model for memory, which assumes that it's all about all of this interconnectivity?
It's fascinating. Is it Kim Peek that could actually read 2 books at the same time, one with each eye?
Correct. Yes, he could
amazing,
do one with each eye.
Amazing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it seems that these incredibly interesting and gifted people are somehow here to show us what's possible, to open our minds.
That's what. Yes, I mean, I get a lot of emails from people who've heard about my work, and they have family members who have autism. And a frequent thing that people will say is, I hope it's part of your theory that they're not mistakes, that they are part of human evolution, because we're moving towards this other way of being. I hope you understand that. And that's something that I had thought that was quite possible, because, it's sort of like, going for, with the computer chips, how they just, each generation, they keep getting,
yes,
just exponentially more powerful. So with the human brain, what else can it do? What is the next way if we're evolving? What is the next, what would that look like? And but the thing though that goes against that idea is something called the acquired savant syndrome, and what that is that there are people who are just like your average person, and then they have an accident, and Jason Patchett's one of them, and they have an accident, and then afterwards they have all of a sudden they acquire these amazing skills. All of a sudden now they're award-winning artist or musician, and it comes effortlessly to them. And so one of the phrases that Daryl Treffert, I got an email earlier from him today, and he's the person who was the consultant to the movie Rain Man and had worked with Kim Peek personally, and he was saying that that they're calling it accessing the inner little Rain Man within you, or something like that. Kind of an interesting concept.
Well, Diane, it's so interesting. I want to ask you about twins, because I've read some of your research on identical twins and the interconnected consciousness that is so often experienced. Could you share with us some experience about these incredible cases?
Oh, yeah. There's so much information about twins, and I was someone who, it's just been part of my path in life that I have been friends with and have personally known over 20 sets of identical twins and 3 sets of identical triplets. I hung out with this one set of identical triplets when I was in 6th grade quite a bit, and it was one of the things that I became fascinated in in the whole phenomena of the people who have so much in common, their genetics, and their family, and they all came at the same time pretty much, and so in the literature there are in the research literature there's just so much information about identical twins where something happens to one of them and then it happens to the other one simultaneously in a virtual way. For example, there's a more recent story of these little girls who were playing on a playground. One of them fell and she bruised her face, and the other girl didn't fall at all, but instantaneously got a bruise on her face at the same time. And there have been cases of where one twin dies in an accident and the other twin feels, searing pain across her abdomen at the same time. And then there are twins who were identical, and they were adopted away at birth, and they weren't adopted into the same family. They were sent to different families, and they were later reunited, because there was this major study out of Minnesota on identical twins who are raised apart, and the number of, call them synchronicities or whatever you want to call them, but the number of things that they had detailed, things that they had in common, just phenomenal. And I think the most extraordinary case are the Jim twins, who had, they were sent to different families, and, sure, okay, they're both given the name Jim, that's not a big deal, but then they both marry the women with the same name, and it's like all of a sudden, and then they both get divorced, and they marry, their next wives with the same name, and they name their dogs the same thing, and and then they and then right before they meet, they both build a white fence around a tree, or a white structure, circular structure around a tree in their backyard. I mean, so what's going on here? And it's like that New Yorker cartoon that I put in my newsletter, where you have the Malfort twins that were separated at birth, and then they're both showing up at this patent house, this patent lawyer's office at the same time, holding the same quirky invention, and they look exactly alike, wearing the same clothes. And some of these twins had that kind of experience. They were wearing the same clothes when they met up with one another, had the same, chose the same brand of toiletries. And one can't explain that kind of synchronicity, by genetics. Some people, our genome is way too simple for that to be explained by genetics. We only have less than 30,000 genes. People thought we were going to have well over 100,000, and I mean we have the same number of genes as a lot of plants. And we share a lot of our genes in common with plants. 47% of their genes we share in common with a mustard plant and bananas. So it's like how, so yeah, sure, they've got the same, genetic, material when they're born, but then, when you go through life, there's all this thing called epigenetics where the genes get, modified, depending upon what happens to you. And so if you look at the modifications of the genomes of identical twins, using technology where you can see, which parts of the genes have been activated or deactivated, and you can compare them, you see that they deviate from one another over a lifetime, because they go on and they have different life experiences. So, if you just do the math of, what are the odds, you have to think maybe there's something else. And then there's all this research about telepathy. So it makes you think, well, maybe, people, maybe they are much more, interconnected than we really actually, think about, because we're too focused on other things.
Well, telepathy is fascinating. Well, what about precognition, Diane? How might we explain precognition when we're actually seeing the future, as opposed to connecting now to someone else's thoughts at this point in time, or coming up with the same invention as somebody else at this point in time? What about transcending time?
Well, see, this is the thing that's always really surprised me, is that here we had, back in 1905, we had Einstein, coming up with this theory of relativity, and we learned that time is an illusion. We learn that time, that we live in space-time, and that the passage of time, deviates depending upon, what speed, what velocity you're traveling at, and that, that there are all of these ways in which the sense that it's an arrow, and that there's a past, present, and a future that goes in a line like that, as opposed to all existing all at the same time. That way of thinking, that the past, present, and future all coexist, that way of thinking has been around for over 100 years in physics. And physics is really the foundation of science. Physics and mathematics. The rest of science bows down to physics and mathematics. As the hard sciences. And everything else, is considered to get softer and softer as you get away from the hard sciences. And so here we are with those sciences where theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. Are these theories within physics that have been proven. And those theories would lead us to believe that the world would be the kind of world in which these kind of events take place. And in fact, if we as human beings could have a conscious experience of this, that we would have these kinds of experiences, such as precognition. And lo and behold, you have people who claim that they, and have actually experienced it, as I said earlier on, someone who told me what was going to happen in the future with me. So I think that we don't really have to redefine physics. It's right there already.
Well, it's fascinating. Diane, I've got a lot more questions for you, and I know you've got an enormous amount to share. We could interview you for days, but we're going to take a short commercial break, and then we'll be back in just a moment.
A new era in psychic services has begun. PsychicAccess.com. You can connect with our psychic advisors by telephone or chat 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. All of our psychic advisors are interviewed, fully verified, and accuracy tested, assuring you quality service. We're living in some very troubled times right now. More and more, the world's problems are affecting us on a personal level. You don't have to deal with this alone. Our highly accurate psychics, caring advisors, and talented mediums can help with situations you are currently experiencing and can let you know what the future may hold for you. All new customers get a free 6-minute reading. All you have to do is register. Why not visit us now and get a free reading at PsychicAccess.com.
Well, Diane, Dr. Powell, welcome back. I want to ask you a little bit more about your personal experiences. You mentioned this fascinating lady who was hospitalized and told you about your future, and you've worked with many, many people as a psychiatrist. Are you able to share with us the case that struck you most from a paranormal perspective?
Well, I don't, well, when you say the case that struck me the most, you mean, because I'd say that the first one that struck me the most, going from, not believing to to believing is, how can you top that, right?
But do you find in your practice that many people have experiences that are not explained by science or the current paradigm?
What I would say, yes. I mean, what I would say is that because of the fact that, anybody who's seen me in my practice, certainly for the last several years, has known that I do research on ESP. If they go online, it's all there, and so they have felt that it was safe to tell me, and I find that what people are calling paranormal are actually it's pretty common actually for people to have had these experiences of something, whether it was something that they would call telepathy or precognition, whether it was in a dream or in an awake state, that a high percentage of people have had something. And what's interesting is even the people who are the diehard skeptics, some of them will tell you about something, but they'll say, but it was, it's not, it's not paranormal, but, but they'll still say, but, there was this weird thing, where, my, crazy Aunt Gladys, she saw a spirit of my, my great uncle, the night he died, they'll have some story like that. And so so I really think that that these are not that unusual of phenomena, but I think that people, because of the fact that there's this protection that people have, I don't want someone to think that I'm crazy, particularly talking to a psychiatrist. I think they frequently don't talk about these things at all to psychiatrists, but because I'm so public about my openness to it, I hear a lot of it.
I laughed the other day with a lady that asked me if I believed in extraterrestrials or other beings that are not on this planet, and I said, well, I'm a medium. It was quite entertaining. Do you feel that there will be scientific validation of mediumship, or the fact that there is life after death?
Well, that one's harder. That's a harder thing. I think because I'm working on. I think the thing that's going to be the easiest to prove is going to be telepathy, that or precognition. They're both big contenders for being the first thing to be proven. And presentiment has been shown, and that's interesting in and of itself. But in terms of mediumship, the problem is that people make the argument, well, how do we know that this person isn't, that it's not just being psychic, and not that being, psychic, but the way they say that as far as because being psychic has already been accepted in some circles, but, being a medium is being psychic and also being able to access another realm. So it takes, so there's an overlap, but there's this group of people who believe in psychic abilities who don't believe in mediumship, and so the problem is that proving that it's not that the medium is picking up things from whoever it is they're doing a reading on.
Yeah, I always feel the best answer to that question is if the medium provides information that even the client doesn't know at the moment.
Yeah, but I know that's what a lot of people would say. But then the skeptics who are, they are, they're that, none with the
pesky
hard
skeptics.
ruler, because they didn't like the look in your eye or whatever. So anyway, they would say, but it could be that someone else knows it. How do you know they're not tapping in? There's psychokinesis, where people
Yes.
will tap into the story, from holding an object that's connected to a crime, for example. So there are other ways of accessing information in space-time. And so the problem is how do you know that it's not just psi? There have been these experiments that have been done in which they what they actually do is it requires a collusion basically on the other side of different spirits to each only give part of the puzzle. And then you all come together, none of you knowing, knowing what the whole puzzle would be, and then you see if all the pieces fit together. Those kind of experiments. So people are looking at that, and then people are looking at all kinds of other possibilities. I'm, as you probably know, I'm on the scientific advisory board for the Forever Family Foundation, and they research on mediumship. They support research on mediumship, and I met this woman there who. Laura Lynn Jackson, she said something that was very interesting to me, and she said that because she's a medium and a psychic, and she said that when she's getting information as a medium, that one hemisphere, she sees it. I don't remember if it was on the left side or the right side, but she sees the psychic information on one side and the medium information on the other side. I thought, well, that's really interesting.
Yeah, my experience is the speed of it. That when you're reading somebody psychically, you can almost continue and read, go on, and it's just steady. Whereas the mediumship is fast. You receive a huge amount of information, but in a nanosecond. That seems to be a difference that I've observed. The speed, the pace of it.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by those kinds of questions, of being able to discern, the differences. And this colleague of mine, he is someone who does QEEG imaging. So he'll do. It's like doing an electroencephalogram or a brainwave, that test that's just, it's a bunch of lines, if you've ever seen those tracings that are done, that neurologists do. So that information, there's a way in which it can be quantized and fed into a computer and give you something that's a lot like a PET scan of somebody's brain, but it's portable. It's much more portable. You can bring this cap and this computer system and set it up, and you can see the person's brain activity and and what's going on. And so I know that he's been doing some work to try to see, does it look differently, when you're looking at the brainwave patterns, what's going on.
How interesting. Yeah. Do you think that one of the reasons there isn't more evidence is to do with the way research is funded, or the fact that there's so little investment in research of the paranormal?
Oh, yeah, that's a huge problem, funding, absolutely, because you have to go to sources outside of the traditional, NIH doesn't fund this sort of thing. So yeah, it's all for private funding, and there, unfortunately, a lot of the universities had programs that have been shut down. So the University of Arizona used to have a program, and Princeton had a program, and Duke University had a program, and they've all been severely curtailed as a result of the fact that it's not the mainstream paradigm, and so it's something that people do, and and you're always searching for ways to fund it.
Well, what are you working on at the moment, Diane? I know that you've got this fantastic book, the ESP Enigma, which, as I said, I read it over and over because there's so much evidence in there. What are you working on now? What are you most interested in at this point in time?
Well, I'm. What I did was I really thought about strategically about how would I go about proving one of these psychic abilities, and who would be the best candidate. And in my book, I not only give give you a good sort of primer on the research that's been done in ESP and for all of the different types of ESP. But then in the second half of the book, I talk about imaging that's been done on people who have psychic abilities and people who have conditions that have a higher incidence of psychic abilities, such as autism. And so I predicted sort of who would be the ideal candidate, and I decided it would be someone who was an autistic savant, because there are reports of them having these ESP abilities, and whenever they do something that's interesting to them, they get really, really, really good at it. And you need that kind of repetition, and reproducibility for science to stand up and look. And so I started searching for someone with autism who claimed to, who reported having some kind of psychic experiences. And what I kept running into were parents and caregivers who would tell me that they had a telepathic connection with their autistic child who was mute. And I became very intrigued by that and thought about my a hypothesis that I bring up in my book. And I'm not the first person to come up with this hypothesis, but it's that perhaps telepathy is a default, or an old communication system that we had before language arose, and it's buried in us. But then, when language is impaired, as it is in autism, then especially somebody who's mute, that it is something that they can do, that they tap into and use. And so I've had this 10-year-old girl who's been referred to me, who is, by reports, telepathic on a real regular, real predictable basis. And so I'm going to be evaluating her.
Wow. How interesting. So is that research that you will be able to publish?
Yes. Yeah, and in fact, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be filming it, because it's the kind of thing where people need to see it to believe it. And so I'm going to have cameras in which you can see what's going on. And then, depending upon what results I get, I'm going to be presenting. I'll be presenting at the Parapsychological Conference in Concord, California. That's this August.
Oh, and I would love to go to one of those.
That'll be in front of other parapsychologists, and they'll let me know if they're we'll be able to discuss what the results are and whether or not we think that it would stand up to scrutiny.
Fantastic. Does one have to be a psychologist to attend a parapsychology conference?
No. No, it's just that you get a different rate if you're a member versus a non-member.
And so
yeah, you should look into it.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. And that conference in Concord, California, is that the foremost in the U.S., or are there several?
This is, if you are a serious scientist in parapsychology, this is the conference to go to, or if you're interested in actually seeing serious science, where people get up there and they present data, whether it's not just presenting positive data. If you have, if you did your experiment and you got nothing, you still can, present it, because we're really not trying to, we're trying to find out what's real. We're trying to,
yes.
We're really trying to do science here, and we are. I think I am impressed with the degree of integrity in their science. I'd say that it's kind of like what they say about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, and everybody goes, "Ooh, isn't Fred Astaire great?" And they say, "Well, the Ginger Rogers did the same thing, only backwards and in high heels." And and I feel kind of like parapsychology is kind of like that. It's just that like you've got to do the same thing, only you've got to do it, under just the most intense scrutiny.
Do you hear many conversations or partake in many conversations amongst colleagues about things that are very easily validated, like astrology?
You're asking me, do I hear people talk about astrology?
Well, yes, is that something that comes up at these conferences or that you and colleagues discuss? Because I, as an astrologer, I think that from my perspective, when I'm with a client, my measure of accuracy, if I'm doing mediumship, is whether the client's saying, yes, I do have an Aunt Betty, and yes, she did pass in August, and yes, she did pass 3 years ago. That's how I know if we're being accurate, if the work's accurate. But then when it comes to astrology, it's anybody can validate it. If it's good astrology, anybody can validate how accurate it is, whether it's
right.
looking at a person's psyche, their strengths in the world,
yeah,
or looking at predictions.
I agree with you. That's been one of those. It's been another one of those things where, what would seem to be logical and rational isn't actually, what happens, in the sense that, of all of these different things, astrology actually has, if anyone really looks into it, it has a mathematics behind it. It has a lot of precision behind it. There's so much to astrology, and yet it is really kind of the stepsister of these kind of conferences. People don't really talk about it, and I think it's kind of one of those things where they're already dealing with the being considered woo-woo by mainstream science, and then astrology. You associate yourself with astrology, and then credibility even drops further. Unfortunately, that's the mentality.
We need to create our own little nation of fascinating people with who are practicing these things and doing the research, etc. But what I'll ask you you might not want to answer this question, so say if you don't want to, but I was reading some information suggesting that some of the technology we have available to us now is reverse engineered from extraterrestrial technology.
Yeah.
What's your view on that?
Well, that's something that I really I've heard that as well, and I don't really know that I don't think that I'm an expert to ask about that. I've certainly met people who are really credible people who talk about that, but I can't say that I really have any expertise in that area.
You haven't reverse engineered any technology from extraterrestrials this week, then, Diane?
That's one career I haven't done in this lifetime.
Maybe you will. Let me ask you this. Telekinesis or psychokinesis. I know that you wrote about psychokinesis in your book, the ESP Enigma. And that's something that absolutely fascinates me. Could you explain or give our listeners a definition of psychokinesis, and then perhaps tell us of the more interesting examples of telekinesis in your research?
Oh, it's interesting, because one of the things that one of my thoughts about psychokinesis is, first of all, to define it. It's basically the ability of one's consciousness, that's psyche, to kinesis means movement. So it's that ability for your consciousness to affect physical matter. And so it could be animate or inanimate. So some of the early research was done on bacteria, looking in the telescope and having the bacteria and the person thinking, I want the bacteria to move over into this quadrant, underneath the telescope, and seeing if they did so, and that sort of thing. And then of course there's the Uri Geller, famous for the spoon bending, and I've had lots of people testify that they went to actual spoon bending parties. That people would show up with a barrel of spoons, literally, and they'd all sit there and rub the spoons and bend them, and so that's those are examples of psychokinesis. But one of the thoughts that I have about it is that we, for us to, for mainstream science to say, psychokinesis is impossible, it's interesting, because think about this. Neuroscience doesn't really understand the mind-body connection. We don't really understand how having a thought really goes from having that thought to us moving, our arm or doing something. We do and we don't. We know that there's, these neurons that go from the brain, into our arm. But that's not what the question is. The question is, how does a thought, go from, a thought to, actually affecting our physiology? And so that is the mind-body connection. And what if your mind had remote effects. That's all it's saying, is that it's not just happening, this mysterious thing that we don't understand with our model that's happening in our body all the time, that maybe that also can happen outside of our body. How can you how can you rule it out when it's such a mysterious thing to begin with, right? That's how I think about it.
Well, as I said, your book is wonderful, Diane, and we admire you for doing this work, this pioneering work. We'll be fascinated to hear about your work with this 10-year-old and the subject of telepathy. Will you be writing another book, or is there a book in the pipeline?
Oh, yes.
I want you to write 100.
I'll definitely be writing a book, and what I'm trying to decide is, and it really depends upon what comes up over the next few months. But I could write a book that is on just telepathy, because that's such a major area of interest of mine. But I also might, the other possibility is writing a book about autistic savants and psychic abilities. And yes, things could go either way, but I'm definitely going to be writing about my research with autistic savants and Psi.
Well, both books sound amazing, Diane. I think the more you do, the better for us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, Diane, before you leave us, can I ask you to just tell us, for our listeners, where can they find out more about your work?
Visit my website. That's the best way to do it. And as you said, DianeHennacyPowell.com. It's DianeHennacyPowell.com.
Great. Well, I've been looking at your website, Diane, and I'll continue to watch. I'm sure our listeners will as well. And we want to thank you for joining us, for sharing all of this with us, and wish you all the best for the exciting work that you've got planned.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's been lovely. Wish you all the best,
Diane.
as well.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for joining us. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Hello, my name is Res Miranda. If you're having relationship, career, or life issues, I'm inviting you to experience what it's like to have access to professional, highly accurate psychics and spiritual advisors you can trust to care and help you. Register now to get your free 6-minute reading by telephone or chat. Get answers. Get access. Psychic access. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. PsychicAccess.com.